Okay, so question 83, free will. Probably the most, I think definitely the most important article here, the one that we'll focus on, Article 1, whether man has free will. Aquinas answers yes, human beings do have free will. Let's look at the responsio first, and he has sort of two arguments. The first, he says, he just begins by saying, I answer that man has free will. Otherwise, counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments would be in vain. So notice here he says, but basically, first of all, he says, man has free will. Otherwise, why would we give people advice? Why would we exhort them, appealing to their emotions? Why would we, give commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments? So basically, he says, whenever we talk to somebody and try to influence the decision that they're going to make, Aquinas says that only makes sense if they have free will. That only makes sense if we think that they have free will. And it's reasonable to think then that they do have free will. He says again, that when we try to convince somebody of something, when we try to appeal to their reason or at least their thought process and change it in some way in order to change their behavior, Aquinas says that means that people have free will. Otherwise, we would counsel somebody, it wouldn't make any difference. And again, notice he says rewards and punishments. So it's not even necessarily when we reason with somebody in a very exalted or significant way. If you simply threaten somebody, if you simply say, if you do that, if you plagiarize on your paper, you'll get a 0. Hopefully you accept that it's good not to plagiarize. But if I simply say, if you do, you get a 0, I'm not trying to show you why. I'm not trying to reason with you in any great sense. I'm just saying, look, here's a negative consequence, so don't do this. So it doesn't have to be sort of reasoning with them in the sense of showing them the truth, simply saying that, simply threatening a punishment. That only makes sense, Aquinas says, if people have free will and therefore can choose, okay, I'm not going to do this because I don't want this punishment. So Aquinas says all of the things, counsels, advice that we give, arguments that we make trying to convince people, exhortations, appeals to their emotions, ways that we try to influence them in maybe irrational ways. But also, again, rewards and punishment, sort of threats that we might make, rewards that we promise, ways to influence people that don't necessarily appeal. Again, it's not a matter of convincing them of the truth. It's simply showing, if you do this bad thing, or rewards also, this good thing will happen. Aquinas says that only makes sense if people have free will and therefore can make their own choices. So he says, people are not compelled against reason. He says, some things act without judgment. He says, like a stone moves downward. Things which lack knowledge act without reason, without judgment. So he says, people aren't like that. People use judgment, and therefore, if you can influence people's judgment, you can influence their actions. And again, that only makes sense if they have free will. He says some things act from judgment, but not free judgment. He uses the example of sheep and wolves. The sheep, just as he puts it, shuns a wolf. That's maybe a little understated. The sheep really tries to avoid the wolf, and it's not because it's reasoning. It's not because the sheep says, oh, there's a wolf, they're a carnivore, their nature is to be carnivorous. That means they eat meat, I'm meat, I should stay away from that wolf. It's not even because they're using experience. I'm thinking the last time I saw one of those, it was eating Steve. They simply shun, they simply try to get away based on instinct. And again, Aquinas says that's not true of people. As he goes on to say, there are contingent things, and people can choose among the different contingent things. So some people might go up to a wolf. Some people might go up to a lion to try to capture it. That's not necessarily a good use of their free will, but they can do that. They can act against their instinct. They can act against fear. So Aquinas says, two arguments here. One, when we appeal to people's minds, when we appeal to their thought process, whether through trying to reason with them or exhort them or simply commanding, prohibiting, rewarding, or punishing, clearly he says we think that people have free will. Otherwise, we wouldn't think that there was any, if what we're doing there is predicated on the idea that there's some kind of connection between what people think and what they do. Therefore, we try to change the way that they think in order to change the way that they act. And then secondly, he says, and again, there are sort of different acts that we can choose, and he says, so we're not just compelled by natural instinct to do one thing or the other. Again, we can actually approach wild animals. But also, again, if you go back to the idea of vengeance versus forgiveness, we have choice there. Aquinas says we're not simply compelled to do one or the other. We can choose among different things. Therefore, there are all kinds of things that we can choose. Therefore, we have free will. And so, as he concludes, for as much as man is rational, it is necessary that man have free will. So again, very important here, a very strong connection for Aquinas between reason and free will, as we'll see here. Now, if you go back to Socrates and the idea that no one does bad willingly, it's not entirely clear that Aquinas disagrees with Socrates. At least from this. I mean, Socrates, remember, the idea was that people choose the good if they know what it is. If they choose something that's bad, it must be because they're ignorant of the good. There's no real criminal vice, there's simply ignorance. And so therefore, when somebody breaks the law, when someone behaves in a way that's unjust, you should simply educate them and show them why the justice would be good for them. Show them what was really good, the right choice, the just choice, and how that would have been good for them, so that they'll choose it next time. And so in that sense, Socrates sort of seemed to think, well, people don't really have free will in the sense in which we usually mean it in morality, that people aren't free to choose between what's good and what's bad. They simply choose what seems best to them. Now, of course, it may not always be that simple. It may oftentimes be unclear what's best, what's not, so it might be a complicated choice. But Socrates says people naturally seek the good, and therefore you can't really blame them for when they're doing something that they think is good. They're simply making a mistake if they're doing something that's actually bad or wicked. And Aquinas would seem to agree with this. That this seems to be largely what he's saying here. He doesn't necessarily respond to Socrates in that way, and he isn't able to show, no, sometimes people maybe choose what is bad. And this is where the objectors come in. The objections here are all worth considering. So objection 1, it would seem that man has not free will, for whoever has free will does what he wills. So the objection, whoever has free will, obviously the whole point of having free will is you do what you will. If you decide to take revenge, you act on that decision and you take revenge. If you decide to forgive, you act on that decision, on that act of will, and you try to forgive. But the objector says, but man does not what he wills, for it is written in Romans, for the good which I will, I do not, but the evil which I will not, that I do. Therefore, man has not free will. So the objector kind of basically introduces the idea of sin and says, look, this is sort of a famous line from the New Testament where Paul is saying, the thing about being human is that you can oftentimes see what's good, and yet you choose what you know is bad, what you know is wrong. So you can actually see, that actually vengeance is bad. You know that you're actually making the worst choice for yourself, and that you should try to forgive, and that would actually be better for you. But you go ahead and you do the wrong thing. You go ahead and you seek vengeance. You commit adultery. You do all kinds of things that the objector is saying people know that it's wrong. It's not that they're confused about what's good and bad or what's right and wrong. They know that, they see it clearly, and they just, even though they see what's good, the will is somehow corrupted by sin. So again, the objector kind of says, look, the idea of sin, this is kind of central to Christianity, that people are corrupted and fallen in a way that, yes, reason tells them what's good, but the will doesn't always, do what reason wants. And so Aquinas replies by saying, as we have said above, the sensitive appetite, though it obeys the reason, yet in a given case can resist by desiring what the reason forbids. This is therefore the good which man does not when he wishes, namely not to desire against reason, as Augustine says. So basically Aquinas says, well, it's true. He says, overall, the picture that I've drawn, the image that I've given of how all of this works is that the sensitive appetite basically obeys the reason, but he says, I have to admit, sometimes it does resist, and the whole system kind of breaks down, and the sensitive appetite goes ahead and desires against the reason. And so basically Aquinas says, this is what happens in that case. The good which you desire, which you don't get in that case, is, as he puts it, not to desire against reason, as Augustine says. So he says what you really want is never to desire against reason, but sometimes the sensitive appetite does that. So basically, Aquinas kind of replies and basically says, well, it's not quite that bad. He says it's true, sometimes the sensitive appetite acts against the reason, but it's not true, this picture, this image, or this idea that the objector seems to have, that Aquinas has gotten human nature all wrong, that in fact human beings are people who see what's good and choose what's wrong. Aquinas says, no, that's not true. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes the sensitive appetite desires against reason, but he seems to say it's not nearly as dramatic or as pervasive or as fundamental as you suggest. And really what's at stake is just not desiring against reason. Again, listening to reason. So he sort of doesn't really deal with maybe some of the larger implications regarding sin and whether or not reason is sufficient. Aquinas says reason is sufficient. What we want is just not to desire against reason. So again, very important connection for Aquinas between reason and the will. Objection 2, further, whoever has free will has in his power to will or not to will, to do or not to do. But this is not in man's power, for it is written, it is not of him that willeth, namely to will, nor of him that runneth, namely to will, namely to run. Therefore man has not free will, So he quotes from the Bible and says, look, people aren't free to, don't really have control over things. Basically, Aquinas' response is that the verses are not saying that human beings don't have free will, only that human beings' free will, or basically their will, by itself cannot accomplish anything without God's assistance. So Aquinas says the passages that you're citing are not denying that human beings have free will. They're just saying that human will by itself is not enough to accomplish anything. It's not up to human beings to decide whether or not their actions will be successful. Basically, he's sort of one of these cases where he sort of just disagrees with the interpretation of the objector, but basically says that again, yes, human beings are not in total control, and God is ultimately making decisions that affect human beings, but that doesn't mean that human beings don't have free will. Basically, objection 3. God moves the will, as the objector says. It applies, or the objector appeals both to Aristotle and to the Bible. And Aquinas' reply is basically that as the first cause, God is the cause of the free will, and as the ultimate end maybe too, but he says that doesn't mean that God is controlling individual acts of will. So yes, in a very grand, ultimate, sort of very, very big picture way, yes, God is the cause of free will in the way that he's the cause of everything, but that doesn't mean that God is causing individual actions of will. God isn't making you choose revenge over forgiveness or vice versa. God isn't making you choose, what to eat for dinner, or whether or not to take a nap, or whether or not to have a cup of coffee. Those individual choices are your own. God is the cause of will in some ultimate sense, but not in the sense of causing individual acts of will. The objection 4, again, is sort of the objection 4 is basically further, whoever has free will is master of his own actions, but man is not master of his own actions, for it is written in Jeremiah, the way of a man is not his, neither is it in a man to walk. Therefore, man has not free will. Aquinas replies, man's way is said not to be his in the execution of his choice, wherein he may be impeded whether he will or not. The choice itself, however, is in us, but presupposes the help of God. So Aquinas says this, again, quoting the Bible, saying, look, the Bible, Jeremiah says, the way of man is not his, neither is it in a man to walk. In other words, again, people aren't ultimately don't ultimately have control over themselves, their own decisions, their own way, as the Bible puts it. Aquinas says that means the execution of the choice. If I choose to commit revenge, I may, for some reason or another, fail. Maybe I use a gun and I forget to load it, and I get there and it doesn't have any bullets in it, or I go to find the person and they've left town or something. If I decide to make a cup of coffee, maybe it turns out I've forgotten to bring coffee or something, so I can't do that. So Aquinas says the execution of the choice isn't up to us. We don't always, our actions, our decisions, our acts of will aren't always realized. The decisions that we make, the things that we want to do, we're not always successful in doing, but Aquinas says that doesn't mean that our actual choice is compelled. We still are free to make those choices, even if we're not always able to carry them out, or to act on them successfully. Okay, and so then another very interesting one, objection 5. Further, the philosopher, again, this is Aristotle, further, the philosopher says, according as each one is, such does the end seem to him. So in other words, according to what type of person you are, the end will seem different to you. Someone who is, constantly, someone who is much more sensual, who has a lot of physical pleasure, who focuses on that, the end, the good will seem to them probably to involve a lot of physical pleasure. Someone who's hot-headed or short-tempered, who gets angry a lot, well, revenge might seem much better to them because they're more inclined, that's the type of person that they are, they're more likely to get angry. And the objector says, it is not in our power to be of one quality or another, for this comes to us from nature. Therefore, it is natural for us to follow some particular end, and therefore we are not free in so doing. So again, the objector says, Aristotle says, according to the type of person you are, thus the end will seem to you. So the end, the good, what you actually desire or want will vary depending on what type of person that you are. Someone who's very comfortable taking risk, obviously, the good will seem different to them than someone who's very risk averse. And so basically, and the objector says that's not in our power, that comes to us from nature. Of course, nowadays we might say, well, upbringing might have a lot to do with it, but let's just say nature, whatever it is, it's not something that we choose. But so the objector says it's natural for us to follow some particular end, and therefore we are not free in so doing. Basically, what Aquinas says in response is that it's true. Human beings are not free to choose our natural quality. In other words, our nature as a human being. And therefore, again, this ultimate end, happiness, the good, towards which the will is directed. So Aquinas says it's true that man or human beings are not free to choose our natural quality. Our natural quality as human beings. We're not free to choose our human nature or reject it somehow. So therefore, this ultimate end that we desire of happiness, he says that we're not free to choose or not choose. But he says we are free to choose our adventitious qualities. But what he calls an adventitious quality, in other words, not something necessary, not something essential or intrinsic, but something adventitious, something kind of that isn't a necessary part of it. Part of us, in other words, our particular moral quality, the habits and the passions, as he puts it, that the person has as an individual. So what Aquinas basically says here is, it's not true that these things simply come to us from nature. If you're hot-headed or quick to anger and therefore prone to think of revenge as a good thing, Aquinas says, you actually have some control over that. You might have to work a little bit harder than someone who's very timid not to take revenge, but you do have control. You can, again, cultivate, practice certain virtues, and that sort of changes the type of person that you are. So Aquinas says, we don't just accidentally somehow through things that have no control over us end up being a type of person who is very quick to anger or who is very focused on physical pleasure. He says these things happen, and we do have some control over them. And in particular, so he says the quality that we have as individuals, this adventitious quality, the fact that some people may be pulled more in one direction or another, as he puts it, habits and passions. He says, these are things that we have some control over, that we can choose, that we can develop, that we can try to work with, and either cultivate certain virtues, work against certain vices, and then further he says, even these inclinations that we have through our adventitious qualities, which incline us to one thing rather than another. He says even these inclinations are subject to the judgment of reason. Such qualities too are subject to reason, as it is in our power either to acquire them, whether by causing them or disposing ourselves to them, or to reject them. And so there is nothing in this that is repugnant to free will. So again, he comes back to the idea of reason and the relationship between reason and free will. So he says, first of all, even if you are quick to anger, that doesn't actually affect your reason. You might feel angry more often, you might feel certain passions more often or more strongly, but Aquinas says that doesn't actually change your reason. It doesn't change the way that you actually reason about things. You can still reason correctly, and therefore you're still free to make the proper choice, again, in accord with reason. You might be inclined to physical pleasure or just sloth or something like that. It doesn't mean that doesn't actually affect your reason. You can still see what you should do. So these qualities don't affect your reason. And again, he says these inclinations, these qualities in themselves even are subject to reason. You can reason about whether or not a particular quality that you've acquired is good or bad, and you can, as he puts it, choose to acquire them or reject them, and so on. So again, he says, people have control over the types of moral qualities that they have. Maybe it's not super easy to acquire one and to reject another, but people do have control, and he says, again, they're ultimately subject to the judgment of reason. And again, he says, and this is sort of Article 2, whether free will is a power. To some extent, this is a technical question involving questions in medieval philosophy, but the key point, again, he comes back to a particular habit, temperance or something, can dispose you towards some acts, but he says free will is a power distinct from habits. So again, it's something that you can exercise regardless of your habit, or as we might say, habits. So again, free will is completely free. It's independent of our non-rational habits. And again, our will is free. Our choices are determined by our free will, not by our habits, or as we might say today, our background, or as the objector says in the first article, our nature. So again, let's take an even more basic example. You can think of anger and choosing revenge because you're quick to anger. But again, Aquinas says that didn't just happen, and you can still, reason still tells you whether or not revenge is good, and reason can also tell you whether or not you should actually try to change this quality you have of getting angry all the time. Reason, well, maybe I should work on that and try to change it. And also, just in terms of habits, again, we can take a much more simple, everyday, homely example. If you're in the habit of sleeping until noon every day, and one day you have to get up at 6 a.m. and you have to be at work at 7 or something, because of your habits, it's obviously going to be very hard to get up at 6 a.m. You're used to being, you've just gotten in, you've just settled into to deep sleep, and you're just starting to enjoy yourself, and suddenly now you have to get up. Maybe you're used to getting up at 10, and so you're 4 hours, right in the middle. You're not used to getting up. When the alarm goes off, it will be very difficult to get up at 6 o'clock because of your habits. But Aquinas would say that doesn't affect your reason. Your reason, the alarm goes off, maybe for a few minutes, you're still asleep, so you don't know what's going on. But the alarm goes off, and you figure out, well, the alarm's going off. I need to go to work. I have to be at work in an hour. I have to get up. Therefore, again, I need to get up. Reason is telling me very clearly what to do. My habits may make it difficult to do it, but Aquinas says we're still free because we still can reason clearly. These habits, or again these inclinations, or these qualities, whatever words you want to use, they may influence. They may make it more difficult to do things, but they don't influence our reason. They don't make us somehow unable to reason. Therefore, reason can still tell us what is right and what we should choose, and so on. And again, he says ultimately reason can reflect on the type of person that we are, and choose to change that, choose to acquire or try to acquire certain qualities, and reject others. So that's basically Article 1 and Article 2. Again, whether free will is a power, we won't get into all of that. The question of whether or not it's a power, we'll just get into some of we talked a little bit about the stuff involving the relationship between free will and habit, but also, again, what we might call habits, qualities, all of these words. Article 3, whether free will is an appetite of power. Again, we can go over this fairly quickly or fairly shortly. Basically, it is an appetite of power. It's not enough simply to ascertain or to perceive the good. You have to choose or desire to do it, which also then obviously means that you're free not to do it. So again, the free will is a desire. It's an appetite. It's a desire for the good. It's not simply a matter of apprehending the good and then just sitting there and looking at it. It's an actual desire for the good. It's a will to have the good, to have happiness, and so on. But again, he says it's an appetite of power, but it's a rational appetite of power. So it's a power that proceeds according to the judgments of reason. It's an appetite or desire that, again, proceeds according to the judgments of reason. It's not just irrational. It's not just a matter of weird, idiosyncratic personal taste or desire. It's not an irrational desire. It's based on reason. Again, what reason tells us the good is. So it's an appetite of power, but it's a rational appetite of power. And then finally, the fourth article of the question, we really won't even discuss, but just to sum up, one of the points that comes up, this distinction that Aquinas often makes between will and choice. Basically, he says will is a matter of, the will basically wills the ultimate end of happiness. We're not free to choose or not to choose this. He says choice, these involve individual means to the end that we necessarily will, individual choices of individual means to the end of happiness. He says that we have free choice. We have free choice among all kinds of individual goods, among all kinds of choices of how to pursue the ultimate good. He says the ultimate end of happiness, we're not free to choose. So in some ways, we don't have free will in that sense, but we have free will about the individual things. We have free choice. So again, question 83 obviously deals with free will, and a lot of, especially in the first article, a lot of interesting stuff about the way that Aquinas tries to understand, okay, what does it mean to have free will, and what kind of objections are there? Again, especially, coming from within his own religious tradition, it's just not true. The objector saying it's just not true that people have that kind of free will, and in some cases Aquinas saying, okay, sure, some of the objectors are concerned with, well, but the Bible says that God has this power, and in various cases Aquinas is like, well, sure, people can't do whatever they want. They're not omnipotent. They're not all powerful, but that doesn't mean that they don't have free will. But in particular, the argument about sin, about people seeing the good but not doing it, or willing the good but doing something else because the will is just fundamentally corrupted or sinful or fallen. And we saw the way that Aquinas replies to that. And again, then the objection 5, the much more philosophical objection, saying the good appears to people different ways depending on their nature, and they don't choose their nature, therefore people don't have free will. And again, Aquinas says, well, they don't choose their nature as human beings, and therefore they're not free to choose whether or not to will happiness, but they do choose individual qualities, adventitious qualities as he calls them, individual qualities they have as people, individual virtues and vices they have. Aquinas says, first of all, that doesn't do away with reason's ability to work properly and to see the good. And secondly, again, he says these qualities themselves are subject to reason. We can think about whether or not they're good or bad, and choose, again, as he puts it, to acquire or to cultivate them or to reject them. So all of that in question 83 on free will.